problem is that we're not
Blacks
telling
here in
the
this
kids
city have made
starting
a
to use
significant
drugs earlier
contribution.
in life than they ever have.
Welcome to Minority Focus. I'm your host, Jimmie Moore, and Paducah has an interesting history, an interesting racial history. Um, Many leaps and bounds forward, a lot of stalemates, and in some cases some reversal in the struggle for civil rights. One person in our, I'll say community, because we're all in this 4-2 area, Bill Cunningham, has written a book about some of those leaps and bounds. It's entitled A Distant Light by Bill Cunningham, and it's about us folks in Kentucky and how we've fared over the years in our racial struggle. If I may, what was your inspiration to write a book like this?
Yeah, Jimmy, it actually concentrates more on the West Kentucky area, although it covers some
Oh,
Kentucky history. The West Kentucky area on racial relations between the Civil War and current day. I was pulled to this subject for a lot of reasons. One was of a very dramatic event that took place in Murray, Kentucky in 1917, December 1916, January 1917, where a black man by the name of Lou Martin shot and killed a white man by the name of Paducah. Paducah was from a very prominent white family, and a lynch mob gave chase, and the circuit judge moved him for safekeeping once they apprehended him from safekeeping to Hopkinsville, and then the lynch mob basically took the circuit judge hostage and threatened to hang him if he didn't bring him back. And Governor Stanley, who was in Louisville at the time, heard about this and actually came to Murray, faced down the lynch mob, and showed a tremendous amount of personal courage in doing so. And it was such a dramatic event that very few people knew about, that I felt like it was worthy of a story, maybe not a book, but a story.
Right.
Once we saw the story, then we looked toward maybe bridging that a little bit and giving a background of the racial relations between the Civil War and the current day. And then I learned in the process that Governor Ned Breathitt, who was the governor, a very strong civil rights law governor, as you know, passed the first civil rights legislation in the South when he was governor, actually had met A.O. Stanley one time. They'd had lunch together in Frankfurt. And so I thought this would be a neat bridge to put together, show the journey, as it's called, from the Civil War to A.O. Stanley's time, and then lead across to the Breathitt era, the civil rights of the 60s, and even capping it off with a modern day status.
With the time frame, and over the years, the loss of material and people, records and all that sort of thing, how difficult was it for you to compose this?
Well, it was very difficult. Writers, I think, of history love to have primary sources. Those are the people who've lived it, who've seen it, who can tell you firsthand, or maybe sometimes it may be recordings, tape recordings, video recordings, and we had people capable of doing that. They were old enough to do it, but we came up with a dry run. I talked to about at least 200-year-old people who still minds were, well, one of them's mind was real sharp. She lived in a remote area of the county in Callaway County, remembered nothing. Another one, a 102-year-old son-in-law of Lou Martin, who lived in Akron, Ohio, was down visiting in Murray, and we interviewed him, and he was so far along in his dotage that he didn't remember much. We interviewed lots of people in their 90s. We did manage to get some audio recordings on some people who had heard people talk about it, but we weren't really able to get any good primary sources, so we had to rely heavily upon newspaper accounts, court records, transcripts of the trial, and even a couple of magazine articles, things of that nature. But primary sources, that's why I said it was most difficult. It was very difficult, was because we had so many of these dead-end runs about for our primary sources.
Not meaning to jump ahead and read the book for anybody that might be watching the show, but in the finale, was the accused exonerated?
Well, I don't want to give away the ending. I'm going to let you read it first.
That I've gotten to that.
I think what we tried to show in the book was the progress we've made, and of course it's spoken from the viewpoint of a white man, and I don't think a white person can really ever fully define the progress we've made because we tend to see it better maybe than it really is because I'm not experiencing it today. There are like people that today say, well, we still have problems. I don't think there's any question about that. But I think one of the most uplifting parts of my generation, and we've had a lot of setbacks in our country over the years, but being my age, being able to see the progress we've made in racial relations has been very uplifting. Right. Because you read this book, it's incredible. And I grew up in the Jim Crow South. Mm-hmm. I know what it was like, and I know how far we've come. It's incredible, though, that we treated each other like we did, our fellow citizens like that way back. And another ironic thing about this book is the people who came to the defense of Lou Martin were either Confederate veterans or the sons of Confederate veterans. Right. And it's almost like these people say, hey, this institution of slavery is dead. We lost the war. Now let's get used to it, and let's bring these people in as equal citizens deserving of equal justice. Right. The defense lawyer who represented Lou Martin did a good job, was the son of a Confederate veteran. The lawyer who argued his case on appeal was a Confederate veteran. And A.O. Stanley, who came to his rescue, was the son of a Confederate veteran. So it seems to me like, in my studies, that where you really get the onset of what I call violent prejudice, you have subtle prejudice and all the violent prejudice that we suffered in this state, maybe throughout the South, was that second generation that came along. You're talking about not in the 1870s, 80s, I'm sure it existed, but you get into the 1890s and early 1900s. And I think this came from simply, as it probably exists in all society, where the people who'd been emancipated from slavery was trying to make their way, and that lower rung economically said, hey, we don't want you shoving us aside, and they became part of the pecking order.
Right. And you're saying that the violent part of discrimination has pretty much disappeared, and now it's more subtle. There's a saying in places about knowing your enemy because you know where he's coming from.
Yeah.
And in today's society, a lot of the subtleness comes from people that you have no idea.
Right.
And that's where I think, correct me if I'm wrong about this, is where the courts supposedly are to come in and make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore.
Right.
That it's not subtle, that even the subtleness of it can be taken care of or prevented.
Yeah. I've seen it, Jimmy, even in the court system. I've been in the court system for 30 years. And when I was first public defender, when I was first Commonwealth attorney, it existed a racism to some extent in the court system. Today, I don't see it. Black parties to lawsuits or defendants, or especially black lawyers, might have a different viewpoint on that. That's why I'm saying a while ago, I'm viewing it from a white man's viewpoint, which I realize is maybe a little skewed. I may be a little more Pollyanna than really it is. But I've seen it. I've lost cases as a prosecutor, I think, because of race. Today, I don't see it. The big problem I see today in our court system is the perception. We don't have enough black jurors. I have 4 counties in my circuit, Caldwell, Livingston, Lion Tree counties, several years ago. We weren't getting any black jurors. Why not? They come out of Frankfurt, they were drawn from the driver's license list and motor registration. I call up there and say, well, I'm not getting enough black jurors. You get a black defendant come in the courtroom, and he looks out there and sees nothing but a sea of white faces. What's his perception going to be? I found that they were fair, that the all white jurors would be fair, but there's a perception, and unless justice appear just, it's as important that justice appear just as it is for it to be just in some respect. It's the appearance. So anyway, I found out that in those 2 counties, blacks weren't registering. They were not registering to vote. And so I talked to all my black friends. In fact, I met with them. We had group meetings. I said, you've got to get out and register. That's where, and I said, look, you don't even have to vote. If you just register, will get you in the jury rolls. So that's where I find that we have the probably the biggest problem today.
Never written a book. Don't know what all is entailed in it. And without meaning any slight or question about what you've written here, I want only to allude to one part of the book that particularly struck me. Found it quite odd, if you will. And I wonder if but a vast majority of black people in this community would find somewhat appalling, and that was that in your mention of the Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake, or Night Riders, period, that on occasion there were black men who were part of those Night Riders, who rode with the Night Riders under a different guise, not of violence and attacking people and harassing people and that sort of thing, but of a different guise, which smacks somewhat of suggesting that today there could be, maybe, black people that are part of the Ku Klux Klan that's doing good things, or things other than attacking or whatever black people. I don't, can you?
Well, first of all, when I finished this book, I had the transcript read by two very good black friends, and I'm not going to mention their names, but you probably
I'll
know
mention their names.
They're Paducans. They may not want me to mention it, but to get their take on it, I want to make sure that they had a perspective on it, and I was satisfied after they read the book that it was balanced. What you're talking about, I think what you're alluding to, is the Paducah Night Riders,
Yes.
which was an economic revolt of farmers in West Kentucky, and black and white. It was a militant arm of the association, which came together to pool the tobacco, keep it off the market, to drive tobacco prices up. There was more black members of that association per capita than whites because they were being hit just as tough economically. They were poor tenant farmers, but their plight was tied in tobacco too. Now, I'm not sure there were certain groups that came into being, vigilante groups, racist groups that came into being that adopted the Night Rider tactics and did things that were not good. Things were not bad. Actually, the Night Rider tactics were not good. They were violent, even when they were inflicted upon independent farmers. But I'm not sure there was a whole lot of good things that were done in the name. It's kind of hard to justify violence of any form. But I don't know of any things that were done under the guise of the KKK that was good.
I grew up in Hickman, Kentucky, and my mom often spoke of the Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake, and I don't know, can't doubt it, total truth, I cannot doubt that. But I know there's a whole bunch of people that's going to see this show that they're not going to hear that.
Well, let me make something real quick. The Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake are totally different than the Night Riders of the Tobacco.
They're not a branch. This is not how the Klan began.
They're entirely different. The Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake was over an entirely different issue. It was on overfishing rights on Reelfoot Lake. See, the history of Reelfoot Lake is kind of interesting because it wasn't theirs since man remember. It was created by nature in 1811.
Earthquake.
And then who owned it? I mean, the land belonged to somebody. If you just kind of threw a lake out there today, when we condemn a river like we did at Barkley Lake and Kentucky Lake, you know who owned the land. You go in there, you condemn it, you buy it. The Corps has their easement around it. We know who owns what. But all of a sudden, by act of nature, you got a lake. So who owns the lake? Well, what happened was the affluent corporations came in there and bought up those rights, and they owned it, and they tried to keep the poor people out, the fishermen, and that's where that got started. That was a very short run, only about 9 months. The Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake was about 9 months, and it was basically a much more sinister band because they went about just murdering people, and that were like representatives that came from the corporation to the area, maybe to bar the fishing rights or whatever. They just murdered them. And so the only comparison between the Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake and the Tobacco Night Riders is they adopted the same dress and adopted some of the same passwords and stuff like that. So you're in Hickman, need to keep in mind that they were entirely two different things. One thing that happened in Hickman, though, was one of the most, or in that area, was one of the most diabolical, cruel, and evil infliction upon a black family. It was the black family down there that was burnt out because supposedly the black man was surly or whatever. Now that was done by the Night Riders of Real Foot Lake, and it was done in Kentucky primarily by Tennessee people.
Exactly, because Hickman is so close.
Yeah, right.
Hickman, Ripley, Tiptonville, down in there.
That's right.
I was thinking about your mention that your mention of the counties or the places that the accused was moved to or had to be moved to Hopkinsville. It couldn't be here, couldn't be there. In this surrounding area, they were moved to get them away from the direct confrontation with those people who wanted to kill them on the spot. But the places that they were moved to, whether it was Hopkinsville or whatever, Carlisle County, wherever, those places weren't necessarily receptive to them or any kinder or understanding or more justice-oriented than where they were moved from, were they?
No, of course not. But they didn't, see, at that time, Hopkinsville, Murray, to get from Murray to Hopkinsville by train, you had to go through Paducah, and if you went there by automobile, our automobiles are still pretty primitive. If you came directly across, there were bad roads, you had to go across two rivers. So there was enough of a distance there that the people in Hopkinsville, except that they had their circuit judge being held hostage. See, Christian County, Trigg County, Lyon County, and Callaway were all in the same judicial circuit. They only got really interested in this case when their circuit judge was being held hostage. As I mentioned in the book, they got ready to put together a mob of their own, primarily deputy, not to do any harm upon Lou Martin, who was in their jail, but to go to Murray and rescue Judge Bush. And then A.O. Stanley came in and sent them back, said, no, stand down, because he saw what would happen. A bunch of armed men get on the train and head to Murray, facing a bunch of men who, partially armed, were demanding that Lou Martin be brought back to Murray. So, no, they weren't really safer places, except they were safer from the standpoint, they weren't safer places from the attitude standpoint, but they were safer places that they were removed from the public sentiment that existed in Callaway County at the time.
Right. Although it was rare that the defense of a black person in a situation like that, or in similar circumstances, was effective, or the cases like that were won or even represented as they should have been. There were attorneys during that era who stood by, respected, and honored the oath they swore, and that was to uphold the law. At the same time, there were those who drew the line when it came to black men and white men. And at that time, the ones who drew that line, I would like to think, would want to think, were of a much lesser seniority or whatever than those who stood by what they promised or took an oath to do.
Yeah. I think that's right. And
was it like a bold step? If you did that, if you defended a black person, was it a matter of your daring to, fear for your life, repercussions from your businesses, your support element, the community, the white community in general? I know of a case in Hickman, Kentucky, where a group of black fellows protesting whatever in their high school years got kicked out of school. And the then white editor of the newspaper wrote the truth in the paper. His name was, I'm not going to be able to say his name now. He wrote the truth about it in the newspaper, and in return, the city, for the most part, boycotted his newspaper, drove him out of business, eventually had to leave town. Did you ever know about that? About that case?
No.
Roe Gardner was his name.
Yeah.
It's been back in the 70s. So I know that happens, if you dare. But in some cases, attorneys who are true, it's not a matter of them daring, it's about what they have to do because they've taken an oath to do it. Is that a dominant attitude that you've experienced in your research about those attorneys during that era?
I think so. Keeping in mind, depending on the type of crime that a person committed, black on black, no controversy. but it's maybe even where you had racism to get into it was where you had a white victim and a black defendant, and that's where it took tremendous courage. But most lawyers, like in this book, Pat Holt from Murray was assigned by Judge Bush to defend Lou Martin. If you read the transcript, you see that Pat Holt was a pretty competent lawyer and did a pretty capable job. So it wasn't like he assigned this to some incompetent right out of law school. And I think most lawyers, and I'll stick up for them at this point and say that most lawyers, worth their salt, at some time in their life, want to be an Atticus Finch.
Right.
Atticus Finch being the one in, To Kill a Mockingbird, who defended the black man accused of rape. I think that's the idea. That's what we're trained. Lawyers are trained to be like that, to pursue that sometimes elusive dream of equal justice for all.
Right.
And the record speaks for itself. The great constitutional law that has helped lift our black citizens from discrimination was comprised of primarily lawyers.
Right. It's unusual and wonderful that you mentioned that the movie Atticus Finch. I spoke about that today in conversation with a coworker on my job. That name came up.
Yeah.
I couldn't think of it.
Yeah.
In discussing parents allowing their children to call them by their first names.
Mm-hmm.
This person was saying no, and I was saying I can feel that because in this movie, they called their father, I couldn't think of his name, like maybe 5 minutes later it came to me, Atticus Finch. But I think that's a prime example of what an attorney should be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, not knowing very many attorneys outside of this area, how that works amongst them, but I'd like to think.
Well, I think that every lawyer I know today would gladly defend a person. I say gladly defend, but those who maybe are equipped to go in the criminal court, a person, regardless of their race, regardless of their religion. That's part of being a lawyer. And if you're not willing to do that, you really shouldn't be practicing law.
Right. What was your objective here? What was your objective in the book?
Well, the objective, I think, was to chart, first to bring forth this dramatic event that happened in Murray and let people read about it. I think it was also to show the progress we've made. I think it was also to bring maybe some credit to the white people who have been involved in that, the A.O. Stanleys, the Pat Holts, the Ned Breathets, who have also been a part of that effort. And, in many respects, it took a tremendous amount of courage from them, in some respects, as much as it did to the black leadership, because at least the black leadership had the solace and the encouragement and support, most instances, of their own race. Whereas the white man that got out in front didn't get that. And Ned Breathitt, for instance, he was never able to come back to Christian County, his home county, without getting a certain amount of harassment and a certain amount of ridicule. Correct. So I tried to bring out some of their heroics in the process. One of the more interesting conversations I have these days, Jimmy, is I like to talk with older blacks that are my age and older, because I lived through the Jim Crow South, and I look at it from a white man's perspective. And I want to know from them, have we really made progress? It's pretty evident to me that we have.
Oh, no doubt.
And so I want to know from them, where do you see that we still have miles to go before we sleep? Where are we still falling down? And of course, you don't have to be an older person to do this. And younger blacks may not be as sensitive to it because they've grown up during the day of integration, whereas black citizens might be and can share those thoughts with us.
Yeah, for sure. And there's that thing too about walking in not judging an Indian until you walk in his moccasins or whatever. If you don't look, you can't see. Right. If you don't talk about it to anyone who knows, you can't know, you can't feel, you can't gain a truthful and realistic knowledge about how things are if you're totally alienated from the people who experience what it is you want to know about. How receptive were the people that you spoke with, say, in Paducah about this? How receptive have people been to the book? Have you had any?
Been very receptive. Everybody's liked it, both colors. Everybody has been very, and I think that it's been universally liked. Now, back to what we were talking about a while ago about perception of black people as to how far we've come. I think it's interesting to me to take maybe people of color in this country who are not from this country. Take Nigerians, Jamaicans, and they come here and they live. They may not see racism as quickly as somebody who grew up in this culture like yourself.
Exactly.
Because regardless of how much progress you've made, you've heard stories. I mean, your grandmother lived through it, so these are passed along. So it seems to me like if you grew up in this culture and you heard your grandparents talk about what was done to them and how they were treated and how all this stuff had to go to separate bathrooms and all that, it would cause you to be a little more sensitive and you'd be a little more aware of maybe if you didn't, something happened, there was a slight to you, you'd have to think, well, is this just a carryover? Because this stuff's incredible. You start reading about the things we did to each other, it's incredible.
Right.
And if you grew up knowing about this, where the person coming in here on the ground floor from,
Exactly.
like I said, some other culture,
Right.
they may go out here and somebody might be a slight against them, go right over their shoulder.
Right. We've only got a couple of minutes here to go yet, though. Thank you for intimating that I may be too young in saying that I've heard my grandparents talk about and all of that. No, I'm old enough that I've lived, a lot of things. Nothing in comparison to what my grandparents or their parents lived, I'm sure. But I've lived some things too along
You
those
have a
lines.
perceptive then.
Seen the signs, seen the white-only signs. Go to the back door of the movie
You
theater.
don't look that old, Jimmie Moore.
Well, not really. It's just premature
You don't look
grade.
that
That's what it's all about. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And joining us and talking
thank you
about
for
your
asking
book.
me. Thank you
Wish
for
you
asking
much
me.
success, and I'm sure you'll have much success with it. Look forward to future books.
Well,
If
I
you want
hope
to do a story about a cool brother from Paducah, remember.
I'll sign you up.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank
Hope
you.
you'll get a copy of the book and read it, draw your own conclusions about what you think about it, and be appreciative of the things that you learned that you didn't know, and be willing to acknowledge that you may be learning something that you didn't know. No instant condemnation, necessarily no instant approval. No? For Minority Focus, I'm Jimmie Moore.